Hello and welcome to Audiobook Connection, behind the scenes with the creative teams. I'm Becky Parker-Geist and I'm your host. Audiobook Connection is your place to learn about the audiobook creative process in discussions between the authors, narrators, producers, and post-production teams that bring them all together, as well as guests who have listened to the audiobooks and have questions for the creative teams. This podcast is sponsored by Pro Audio Voices, helping great stories come alive through audiobook production and marketing. Hi, I'm Becky Parker-Geist, and I want to welcome you to the Audiobook Connection podcast. Today I have with me author and co-director and co-producer Sheldon Collins, author of The Legend of Valentine, and Daryl Bolicek of Wild Horse Recordings, who is the sound designer for the audiobook of The Legend of Valentine. Sheldon, Daryl, welcome.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
So, Sheldon, why don't you kick us off and tell us a little bit about The Legend of Valentine itself and give us some background, some context. Why write The Legend of Valentine at this point? Or, tell us a little bit about the writing and publication piece.
Sure. So I think when this comes out initially, and people might listen it to your audience might listen to it later, it's coming out just before Valentine's Day 2026. So audiences might listen to it later on. So it's an exciting period, right? We're right before Valentine's Day right now. And we've all put so much work into this, everybody that's on the call with me today. And it's just all coming to a pinnacle right now. And I know just the world, we know about 4 billion people around the world celebrate Valentine's Day this Saturday. So that's incredibly exciting. My process, I was very inspired by what I would call the legend itself. And I'm gonna try to make that distinction here. So, when I talk to historians and writing this and going through that process, when you look at just really the 3rd century, just from a historical facts, it's a little bit sparse in terms of like who Saint Valentine was, right? We basically know that he was a person who married Christians, possibly married Christians. Actually, that storyline came a little bit later, their storytelling rather. But we know that he was a Christian martyr in Rome, and we know that basically that whatever the acts were that he did at the time, when you speak to historians, that caused his martyrdom, basically. And so that was something that he was commemorated for, defying the rule of the autocratic government at the time. And, he was celebrated really kind of his martyrdom was celebrated really kind of in a religious context. And that grew with the church's preservation into the 6th and 9th centuries. Valentine appeared in what was called martyrologies, which were church calendars of saints. And then what's very interesting is how the legend began to develop over 1,800 years to what we all kind of just accept as fact right now, right? So there's these historical nuances, but there's also just all this brilliant storytelling that added to what we call the legend today, right? So in the 12th and 13th century, this is interesting. It basically introduced what's called the medieval hagiography. And this is when miracle stories begin to emerge, and Valentine restores the sight of a blind girl. So all of that came actually years later in terms of this long lineage of storytelling. Then in the 14th century, skipping forward, there was this major shift. And Geoffrey Chaucer, a well-known poet, came out in Parliament of Fowls in 1382, and he wrote this line. He said, "For this was on St. Valentine's Day, when every bird comes there to choose his mate." And that moment then, for the first time, Valentine's Day is associated with love, pairing, and nature. So there was no mention of Valentine as a character. The romance becomes attached to the date, not the man. But then later in the 16th and early 17th century, there's the Renaissance period. And William Shakespeare wrote Hamlet, that we all know and have heard of today. And in Hamlet, Ophelia says the famous quote, "Tomorrow is St. Valentine's Day, all in the morning betime, and I am made at your window to be your Valentine." And so this was just the incredible shifting of the romance legend that we celebrate today. It introduced the idea of choosing, being chosen, personal romantic expectation. And this is where suddenly the modern concept of My Valentine truly started to take shape. And now when we skip a little bit later, 18th century, there's all these romantic correspondence that start to happen. Valentine's Day is suddenly linked to handwritten love letters. And so even in the story, we get that there was a love letter that Valentine, wrote to the blind lover, right? And so that moment is when all of a sudden it takes on the shape of From Your Valentine. And there were these love letters. And then 19th century Victorian era suddenly mass produced Valentine's cards, and that went right in alignment with what was happening throughout Europe and America. This idea that Valentine may have written a letter, a card, takes on shape, and then we go into the 20th century when there's the full commercialization. There's cards, candy, jewelry, a media, and Valentine's Day becomes this global and largely secular event. And so suddenly the church says, around the middle of the 20th century, in 1969, they said, whoa, 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 this has gotten a little out of control here from what really, we have evidence happen in the third century, right? So they removed Saint Valentine from the general Roman calendar, but they didn't remove him as a saint because the spirit of what he stood for still resonated with a modern day audience. And so when I wrote The Legend of Valentine, the challenge was to weave all of that mythic retelling into one, in this case, audiobook, but book and audiobook. And so that's what we all collectively achieved. And we're all collectively part of this nearly 1,800 years of storytelling. So the work I've done in the last 20 years and the work that both you and Daryl have done in the last 2 years is merely just a blink in history, right? So we're
Well,
just
I feel like we're that next phase of, we've gone through we had the cards, we got the candy, now we have the audiobook that you can give as a
absolutely
Valentine's gift to the one that you love.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
Now,
And
evolving.
what's nice is what I try to do in the writing at least was just add a layer of this theme, add a layer to the theme that's been ongoing, which is really about love and overcoming adversity. But there is a new layer in it, and I don't want to give away the story, as you know, but there is a new layer that was never part of the quote unquote legend that I think gives audience and listeners hope. And so I think that, at the root of it, the core of it, when you think about, and I wrote this article recently that's come out in the newspapers, and it's basically trying to make the argument, which I feel like holds water, that this is the greatest celebrated legend of all times. Because if you think about the word celebrated legend, there's not many other celebrated legends. There's like King Arthur, there is Robin Hood, but there's not many that we come together as humans every year and celebrate it in such a mass number. And so it's a very exciting story because as storytellers, there's not many legends or stories like this one. So I feel a real honor that we've been able to pass this forward to the next generation, and just excited to be a part of it.
Yeah, and as we, with this, it now being available in today in this context, but also in a way, it almost cycles back because you brought that history back into the storytelling of this day, and I think that's a really delightful, wonderful thing that's been achieved. One of the things that I wanted to focus on this particular episode is where we went from that point where the book was completed and ready for audiobook production. And as we moved through the recording sessions where we, Sheldon and I co-directed those recording sessions, and we had a cast of 20 actors from around the world. And then as we completed the voiceover aspect of it, we moved into the sound design element. And that is where Daryl picked up the mantle, or where the baton was not, I wouldn't say that the baton was passed so much as he was brought into the process as we continued to work together to bring it to this fully immersive sound design experience. So Daryl, when you first started to experience this project, and I put it that way because I want to leave it open to whatever that experience was like for you. Tell us a little bit about what came up for you as you started in the process. And yeah, we'll just start there.
Well, the first, thanks for having me on. And I really appreciated working on this project. I learned a ton, and it was a super fun, immersive, creative process that I thoroughly enjoyed. I do remember the first thing I thought when I started listening to the dialogue and the narration was that the writing was extremely descriptive, which immediately posed a challenge for me, which was how to figure out how to allow the author's writing and description and like the way they're describing the scenes, how to allow that to still be the forefront of the story in the audiobook, because at the end of the day, it's an audiobook. You want to listen to what the author wrote. You're reading a book, right? Well, there's a fine line between taking every description that the author wrote and creating a sound effect for that, or deciding that you are going to allow the reader to use their own imagination for certain things and let the sound effects take on a different role in that matter, which would be enhancing some of the words rather than like sticking it to you every time you hear a stomp on the ground, that there has to be a stomp. If the narrator says, and then he gently stomped on the ground, that became a challenge right out of the gate to see how we were going to pull that off. Because Sheldon, you're writing, and the way that the narrator describes scenes, it didn't initially when I was listening to it, I was like, well, man, he's describing this perfectly fine. Like, what could possibly, my brain can already dive right in. So as we started progressing into it, I realized that I was the enhancer. How am I going to enhance these words and just bring you directly into the story? So that's my initial take on what I stepped into and what I heard right away.
One of the things that I thought that, as you started to develop the soundtrack for this, one of the things that I so loved that you brought to it was the ambiance. We could hear that we're in the forest without it being, like, we could feel that we're in the forest without it being hit over the head with it. We don't need to hear the crow or the bird every, 5 seconds to remember that we're still in the forest. And there was actually a really perhaps wonderful, perhaps antagonizing, I don't know, or annoying, I don't know whether it was to you, Daryl, or not, but we were so meticulous, I think, about when it was, for example, all right, one too many birds, right? Finding those little moments, where just like anything that would take us out of the story rather than drawing us further in, we would address.
Yes.
Right.
And the funny thing about the birds is that's a common issue I have with any outdoor soundscapes, because the bird is what immediately will paint the picture to the scene. And when you remove all the birds, then sometimes maybe the wind or, the wind or the trees moving in the wind just sounds like wind, or you don't have that, the bird and the tree kind of go hand in hand type of thing. So that was another one of those little challenges. And then learning how to edit and EQ out those bird chirps and stuff was, it was part of the fun.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing, the way our minds will not always correctly interpret what we're hearing. So we need to provide, well, the story itself obviously is providing context, but it does help to have those other little, sound effects that sort of make it hit home fully that, yes, that's what I'm hearing. I'm hearing what the story is telling us about.
Yeah.
And so, Sheldon, as you first started to listen to some of the work that Daryl was producing, do you remember now what some of your first thoughts were?
Oh, all of them. No, well, I mean, first, this ended up being the SOVAS award-winning, outstanding production, winner. And also Daryl is the winner of the SOVAS for the best sound engineering in the US. And so You think about.
And before you go on, let me just interrupt because not all of our listeners will know what SOVAS is. So I want to let them know. So that stands for the Society of Voice Arts and Sciences, and the SOVAS Awards are kind of like the Academy Awards in the voiceover world. And so for Legend of Valentine, we won Best Audiobook Production as well, or Best Audiobook Producer, as well as Best Sound Design. So continue on.
Yes, and that best sound design went to Daryl, and we both picked up, Becky and I, for outstanding, not only best producers but outstanding production. And so my point in bringing that up is not to toot our own horn, but is to say, what I think people will eventually be listening to this and going, okay, how did they do that? So, at least in the industry, they will. Maybe not your average listener, but people that are making audiobooks, they might want to listen to this because we did it. And the reason we did it is because we were well, first of all, very talented, but we were also very meticulous in terms of how we went through. And we had multiple ears on this with Daryl's guidance as it came into his department of sound engineering, which was really extraordinary. And the reason I think that when I think back of that recognition is so well deserved, first of all, in the sound engineering, is because it takes that meticulous ear to go in and say, all right, the birds aren't working here, the horses need to be like this, and constantly Daryl, how many times would you go over a scene, for example, just in your process, just to give listeners an idea, because they hear stuff like, oh, the bird here, the horse there, but what does that really mean in terms of the work behind it? I'm sorry, Becky, I don't mean to be jumping on the question, but I'm throwing it back to you, Daryl, in terms of kind of relating what that process is like.
Yeah, well, I think the first step was getting down the initial ideas so that the rest of the team could hear where it was going. And I've always been in the camp of collaboration is best. And I had two amazing collaborators to work with. And finding, you asked kind of a technical question. That was when figuring out the sound to put in, you have to sit back and close your eyes, play it maybe a minute beforehand and let that part come in. And if it doesn't immediately come across to you as cheesy or that doesn't sound right, I would have to find different samples or create them myself. So there was a lot of Foley stuff on my desk and all this other stuff, but laying down the initial idea was ultimately where everything started for the collaboration. It was like, you guys gave me basically the direction to go ahead and lay it down. I went through it with my eyes closed. I always say that because it's really how you get into it. And then lay that down, send it off to you guys for a review, and then listen to your thoughts on it. And I think that's why it turned out so good, is because of the collaboration and the direction that I was getting. Because at the end of the day, everyone interprets it a little different. And if you could take all the different interpretations and hone them into one idea, bam, it's going to be better than any one of those ideas. And so that's where it started taking off and really making sense. And regardless of the sheer amount of work it was all so well worth it.
Right. And I'll just add that I think that, going back to your question, Becky, that, what makes somebody actually able to win that type of recognition is, I think, the ability to first, just like I can relate it to the writing process, is to first be able to lay down that first draft, so to speak, that Daryl was talking about, of the sound Foley and all the sounds he's hearing that aren't, as he put it, not too cheesy, but right on the mark, but not under designed, and then be able to, which is probably the hardest part that sets sound engineers, makes them more distinctively different from one another, is to be able then to get notes, interpret notes, and figure out where that perfect amount of balance is in the sound engineering process. And Daryl can do that exceptionally well. And that's why it's resonating so well with audiences and award committees now, is his ability to design that because, even as a writer, I get notes back, and notes come back at you, and they're not on the nose. They'll be like, okay, something's off here, and I'm not the world's greatest note giver as a director, and nobody is. But the artist, to be able to interpret those notes and figure out what the audience what will resonate with them perfectly is Daryl nailed it on this. And so, fortunate to be able to work with you, buddy. I really appreciate the process. At the end of the day, that's why the awards came in, and that's why the audience are responding to this type of work.
One of the things that I think also is really interesting is perspective. And we talked about this quite a bit. There were moments where, for example, the horse is riding away with Agatha, and Valentine is left behind in the woods, and understanding, clarifying amongst us, like, where is the listener? Is the listener back in the woods with Valentine, or is the listener riding away with Agatha in that moment? And in just a regular narrative, without a sound design, it wouldn't matter. But it does when it comes to sound, because then we have to adjust. You want to tell us, Daryl, a little bit about what kinds of adjustments had to take place in order for that experience, for the listener to have that experience?
That was another one of those times where I would do it the way I saw it right out of the gate. And it's not that I had a ton of time to form the opinion. I was listening to it as I was listening to it. And wherever my mind went is how I would do the sound design, and then rely on the feedback to see if my interpretation was right or not. And it was maybe about 50-50. I did a lot of corrections in the regard of perspective, and my mind wants to say, like, where's the camera at? Like, where's the camera? Where's the listener is what it really is. But yeah, so that was a little bit of a challenge too. But at the end of the day, like you said, if you're doing the sound design, those things really truly matter. You can't just pretend that, you can't just blow by that stuff. You have to hone in on it and focus on it. Also, the transitions, knowing when an actual, I feel like I could always use a little hand with, like, where the transitions fall, because sometimes the narrators, their tone might not change a ton, and maybe there needed to be a little bit more of a space to really understand that there was a full-on scene transition. So those were other spots where I would probably miss the transition and then get confused as to why my sound design wasn't lining up to the narrative. And then we'd listen through again and I'd get those notes and it's like, oh yeah, I missed a transition. No, that makes sense.
Let's just take a short pause, and I want to make sure our listeners do stay with us, because at the end of this episode, we're going to include a sample from Legend of Valentine. I want to make sure that you get to hear that. So we will be right back. Listeners are in for a treat as the multi-award-winning audiobook edition of The Legend of Valentine recounts the exploits of the legendary Saint Valentine, his blind lover, Agatha, and a cast of characters voiced by 20 narrators. Winner of Best Audiobook Production and Best Audiobook Sound Design by SOVAS, Society of Voice Arts and Sciences. Winner of the 2026 Independent Press Award for Best Audiobook. Get your copy today at AMPlifyAudiobooks.com. For more information, visit thelegendofvalentine.com. Okay, so Sheldon, you have been receiving a lot of, well, I guess we, but I say you, have been getting a lot of really great critical acclaim for this. And not only did we come away from the SOVAS Awards with trophies, if you will, awards, but also the Independent Press Award. The audiobook won that for 2026. Would you share just a few quotes from reviews that you have received for the book or the audiobook?
So sure. And I would say this is collectively earned, not just myself. You guys I couldn't have done it without you guys. So, but I think that, some of the ones that were very honored and appreciative to receive, I'll talk about Kirkus first, because Kirkus was and I think it's one of the most meaningful reviews that we received, because, and this is a great example of how collaborative art form, whether it's in film or audiobooks, just evolves material so well. Because when I received a review from Kirkus a year prior, it was on the book only, and the book received a lot of great reviews, but Kirkus is tough. And they came back and said, I think one of the quotes that was positive, but still not as great as I would have loved it, was like, they said, like a complex and exciting adventure or something like that. So it was like, okay, it sounds pretty good. It's not like the most outstanding book I've ever read, but it was nice. But what was amazing was that a year later, Kirkus came out with a review after they listened to the audiobook. And I think what happened, it really allowed the listener from Kirkus to just become so much more immersed in the world, that with all these characters and all these different storylines going on, they really got it and they were there. And the review said, standout performances and cinematic sound design immerse listeners in a vivid ancient world they won't soon forget. So that was a beautifully written review, and it kind of summed up the journey here, I think. I mean, I don't have to read them all. You can go to the legendofvalentine.com website and read them there. I mean, we got almost every single independent reviewer in the country that left favorable reviews for the book and audiobook. But I was most excited about Kirkus because they're tough. You don't pan, and they really lit up after this audiobook came out, because you could tell that they appreciated so much all the work that we put into it, which was a 14-month production, right? And everything from the story to Daryl's incredible work as a sound engineer to scoring, music, mix, and performances. And I'm sure I've forgotten some other stuff, but editing, there we go. And I think that brought them so much more into the story and the world, and helped them to distinguish different voices and characters well, because it is a big epic. I've been doing book club interviews and participation lately, and I just did one with the California Literary Society, which is a very old book club here with a lot of women, and some of them loved the story, but they definitely had to write down characters to keep tracking it, and the other ones listened to it and they said they didn't have to do that at all. And so it was just it shows you how through this wonderful medium that we work in, how it's able to connect all that literary tissue together. So that's fantastic.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. Daryl, was there anything about, the full cast, just, hearing the different voices with all the many different actors, or a cast of 20? Is there anything about that you want to say, either about a challenge that may have been caused, or anything along those lines?
Yes. This type of work inherently has a whole host of challenges, because it is a difficult thing to do. There's a lot of stuff on the back end that I typically don't share. It's all the fun stuff that I've gotten good at through the years, which is like, all the actual effects, not the sound effects, but the effects like compression and noise gating and all of the fun audio engineering stuff. There's a lot of that's going on there too. Yes, there was one standout thing that I would like to see the industry get better at, I guess, would be that there's more of a standard audio quality coming from all actors. So when we have like, say, 20 actors, we have 20 different microphones, we have 20 different audio interfaces, and we have 20 different people that are it's called record engineering, because if you're actually recording something, you're a record engineer, and everyone has a different flavor and a different taste. So for me to get all of those microphones to sound like they're in the same room is a monumental challenge and almost impossible. But at the end of the day, it is doable, and you can do it. Now with modern technology and these modern plugins that we have that emulate either analog equipment or they're just new algorithmic software, you can take the room tone of somebody's voice and you actually eliminate it, and you could turn that room tone into a different room tone. So there's all those tools that are in the box as well. And so that's the big challenge. I see in the future that perhaps with even more tools or just voice actors dialing in what the industry is going to demand of them, is that people have more of a congruent sound. Their rooms that they're recording in is like hyper important. That seems to be the biggest challenge, is the sound of their room, not only the microphones and their equipment, but the sound of the room that they're recording in. Every room sounds different. And I particularly hear every room like night and day. Now, most people don't. But most people would never care or even ever notice it. But I like to just, if you're going to do a pro job on something, you hone in on all those little nuances. And if you can correct a little bit of every nuance that needs a little bit of correction, at the end of the day, you end up with a really awesome sound. But just correcting one or this or a little that, you need to do all of it. A little bit, a lot equals a better product. If that makes any sense.
And there again, you just such great work. So thank you again on that.
Yeah.
And in terms of so the audiobook includes quite a bit of music as well. And the music that we used was a combination. Some of it was sourced material that was licensed from libraries and selected meticulously to make sure that it fit what we were doing. And then, of course, there were those moments where it's like, no, just can't find anything that quite fits this exactly the way we need it. And Sheldon, talk to our listeners, tell us a little bit about what that next step in terms of bringing in Stephen, who unfortunately is not on this with us today.
Yeah, and it's important to mention that that was a shared one with Stephen Endelman too, who's a Grammy-nominated composer. In terms of the SOVAS sound engineering winning team here, and that brings us, to talking about that process with music, and like Becky just said, and there was a void in terms of trying to find just music that perfectly complements the love story all the way through. That is difficult to do when you're just trying to go to licensed or sourced work. That's where, even when I'm directing a film, it gets into that, okay, we can put this music here or there, but wouldn't it be great if we could just have somebody sit down and design that original music all the way through that thematically perfectly flows with, a love story, which was Stephen Endelman coming into the picture. And he was just such a joy to work with. He's such a talented guy. He's just so gifted, and he nailed it. And I had no idea whether or not he was going to nail it or not. But I had a feeling, Grammy nominated is the first clue. But
we had a lot of time pressure on that.
He had a lot of time pressure. We had to do what turned out to be, I think he probably did over 100 scores, or 100, originally composed little bits for this. And when I say little bits, they could be anywhere from, a few seconds long to, sometimes 20, 30 seconds, maybe even a minute long. And it was quite the process, because similar to sound design, he would sit down and he would create all this original music in his studio at his house. And then I would go listen to it at his house, and I would give him notes, same type of process back and forth. And Becky would then hear it as a director too. Daryl would eventually hear it, because not only was he doing the sound design and contributing to the music sourcing, but he did all the mix. And so I definitely liked hearing everybody's opinion. And but at the end of the day, the work I did with Steven, just back and forth, sometimes all day long. I think we'd be in the studio for 8-10 hours sometimes, just going over the feel of the music. And that was what was so important to me. And Steven and I both shared that musically, is that we wanted a certain feeling for the audience to feel when they got into it, especially with the music between Valentine and Agatha and the love story. Some of the other stuff, battles and other parts, were not originally composed, but that music that carries us all the way to the end of the music and weaves throughout it was just really came together. It was, first of all the credit goes to Steven for all that original music, but the collaborative process was, again, very fulfilling and exciting in terms of how it evolved from the very first draft of the score to the final. And it's one of those examples of just the creative collaborative work at play when everything just starts to line up right. And I just remember sitting down one time and listening to him play some music for me for this one scene, and I was like, that's it. And you get little miracle moments like that, and that happened with Daryl and I too, which was fantastic, with his source music and sound design, and even the way he edited some stuff together that never would have worked on its own. That collaborative process that we all participated in, yourself included, Becky, was just so rewarding the way it all came out. And musically, I think people who really appreciate music are going to listen to this and be blown away, because it is about 5 times the amount of work that you would put into scoring a regular feature film, because most films are about 2 hours long, and this is about almost 12 hours long. So it was quite the process. Stephen did a phenomenal job. And then it really required a lot of job in the mix afterwards, after you have all these layers of sound, right?
Yeah. Daryl, do you want to talk about that aspect?
Well, I can tell you that it's another one of those kind of personal things, because I don't share this stuff. But the sessions, some of them are pretty profound. Some of the chapters had over 100 tracks that were all mixed together with different sounds and Foley and music and all that. And then the editing and all that stuff. Some of the sessions got quite lengthy and filled, and it's fun to see how all that just kind of culminates into a chapter that, like, it just breathed all that life into the chapter, and it's pretty cool stuff. And the music, yeah, I will say that the music that Stephen added in was truly like the cherry on the top. Like, if it wasn't for that cherry, it would have just been a great audiobook. But then you throw in like a custom original love story theme that is generated throughout the entire book. That was just, that's what really made it cross the finish line, I think.
Made it exciting.
Yeah. I would love to just spend a few minutes talking about, I think it's chapter 1, the chariot scene. And this was one of those where there's so much going on in this story. Daryl, tell us a little bit about, like, what that first pass for you was like with creating that design for that chapter.
I remember that pretty vividly. The chase scene with the chariot was, I want to say, like, without knowing, maybe like 10 minutes long. And I was a little bit like, how do you introduce the sound of the chariot and all the drama that's going on without like annoying the listener with all of the noise that could be happening in that scene? So I just did, I think I said something after I sent that chapter, whenever I had an opportunity to share a thought or a note on it. I think I had mentioned, like, I don't really know what to do here, because this is a lot of stuff going on, and it's a lot going on. And I think that through the different variations or versions of editing and going through that part, we trimmed the fat. We trimmed everything that could possibly be trimmed, but we did leave the chariot in there. Probably got lowered in the mix to just not, we were just being hypercritical of it being maybe too much, because I think that a lot of sound design audiobooks, or at least some of the ones that I've heard, they won't be that hypercritical of that. They'll just leave it in, and then you listen to it and you're just maybe a little overwhelmed. And if you're listening to it at a level where the voices are nice and hot and pretty loud, and if you have also a bunch of sound design, it gets too loud and you can lose your focus. You can lose what the narrator's even saying, because there's just so much going on. So that was my initial take on that one, is and that kind of set the tone for how we continued out through the book, is to be hypercritical of not getting in the way of the story, the narration, the characters. We were just painting a black and white photo with colored pencils, nice and lightly adding color to this whole audiobook. And that became our job and our focus. And I think it's almost kind of a good thing that one of the first scenes in the book, first action scenes, like, that laid it out for us right out of the gate. So that helped actually a lot.
Yeah. Sheldon, did you want to?
He pretty much summed it up there. I mean, I would say that something that's very interesting about the SOVAS made us pick certain parts from the audiobook, because you don't present all 12 hours of the audiobook, for different categories, and sound engineering won in a couple different submissions that we sent, or nominated in a couple different submissions that we sent in. But the winning piece was the very last piece of the entire audiobook. So sorry, audience. If you want to hear what actually put the whole project at the top as far as sound engineering, music, and everything goes. You got to listen to the whole thing. So there you have it.
I listened back to that on my studio monitors here, and I was so I don't even have quite the right words for it, but I was so surprised, but also like, just like, wow, I just never thought of it like that. I hear it now. I get it. I get that ending was not only, it was almost like that the storyline and the narrator himself amplified mine and Steven's work there at the very end, because that was Steven's original music at the end. And I was being very subtle. I was literally looking at the end of the book like it was a movie. And what would a movie do in this situation? You might not even notice the music right away because you're so involved with the words that are being spoken and how dramatic perhaps those words could be, or heartfelt or whatever. And so as I was listening to it, I was thinking like, okay, this is what won, huh? This is interesting. But it really opened my eyes to like, okay, this is kind of more of that particular spot was very, very professional sounding. And, even if it wasn't me that did it, I would listen to it and be like, yeah, that's pretty much exactly what was supposed to happen there. So maybe that's what it was.
Well, sometimes restraint is just as important as production, right?
Yeah.
So
I think like what you were saying earlier, Daryl, I think this is one of the things that I recognized early on, that you and I are very much in alignment in terms of how we feel about the overproduction. What is, I think, all too common is that, when you have a full cast immersive sound design, it means big, lots of sound, and to me as a listener, that can be so overwhelming. I just feel like, well, no
it is.
thanks.
You don't have the visual stimuli to help enhance that stuff. It's all just your ears.
Yeah.
So very, very important.
But the other submission that got nominated as well was probably the one you're going to play, I would imagine, at the end of this clip or something like that. The one that felt, I'm not going to use the overproduction, but it's incredibly rich in sound.
Rich is different. Yeah. It's I think, correct me, Daryl, if I'm misstating what you meant, but I know when I'm talking about that, it is partly about where is the story in the mix, that many times all the sound effects and music are overtaking the words of the story. So they're actually more distracting than they are supporting. And that it can be very rich, as it is in that chariot scene, which is the one I'm tempted to add in there.
And you should.
Yeah. It's so incredible. But there's a lot going on, but the story is what is, it is supportive of the narrative that is happening. So it's not overtaking it in that way. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you play that one, my favorite part of that clip is the very end when when the loud noises stop and the quieter noises start. I think that part's pretty cool. Without digging in too much on that, like the hitting the bottom.
Yeah,
that was something I was really, believe it or not, I was excited to do that because that's an EQ trick. It was actually just me going like this on my desk.
You're talking about the very final moment of the chariot clip that the audience will hear.
Right when at the bottom of the water.
Yeah, without giving it away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that end, so listen for it when you're at the end of the clip, there's also one of those point of view
changes,
perspective changes that happens. That
yes, which I was. I'll just be honest. I wasn't on board with that because I was stuck down on the beach. So I had a hard time because I had this idea that we'd be able to hear it off in the distance. So, but that's where the collaboration is, because as the author Sheldon would say, no, the perspective changes there. This is the way I wrote it. It's like, oh, well, then it has to do that. That makes sense. Okay.
Yeah.
But then we just.
I'm not always right.
Well, that perspective change.
Every now and then I have my moment.
Well, that perspective change so happened to be your writing and the way you thought it. So that has to be done.
Yeah.
That way.
And of course, all this work that we did on the audiobook itself, all this production work happened over, virtually over Zoom calls and phone calls and emails and all of those were the tools that we were using as we were working together, plus some other tools as well, of course. But we had the opportunity in January 2026 to come together and get to meet in person, which was so fun and so cool. One of those things that, as we work with people, all over the world. And in fact, one of our actors who had flew in from India for the awards event, the SOVAS awards event, Manish.
Yeah.
And so we had, he was there. We three were there. We had our project manager, Jerry Lee, was there. Nick, one of our actors in the cast, was also there. So it was really quite the delightful event to gather in person. Yeah. And thank you, Sheldon, for really kind of pulling us together to make all of that happen. I think you were big.
I'm just glad everybody showed up. So that's good. And that we sweep the awards. So that was a lot of fun too. It's fun leaving pretty much as everybody is a winner. So, and that's what it was at the end. So
yeah, we went in with 8 nominations across 4 categories. So it was pretty exciting showing up. Yeah.
Very exciting.
Well, I want to thank you both so much for the opportunity to work with both of you on this project, and for the opportunity as well to talk about it here on my podcast, Audiobook Connection. So thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having us on. What a great time.
My pleasure. All right. Thank you. Thanks for joining us for Audiobook Connection, behind the scenes with the creative teams. Please take a moment to subscribe at audiobookconnection.com. The podcast is sponsored by Pro Audio Voices, helping great stories come alive through audiobook production and marketing. Learn more at proaudiovoices.com. Again, thanks for being with us, and please join us next week.